Azhar is one of the most experienced instructors on our team, but he's put a lot of work into this webinar. So Azhar, tell us why you chose this topic.
Thank you very much, Dan. I really appreciate that. And thanks for your kind words. And I'm really excited to be here. ITIL is, one of most interesting fields. And I get a lot of trainings through QuickStart for this ITIL. And the reason I chose this change management is because there are 26 processes which are covered in this ITIL foundation course. And out of these 26, there are few processes which are very commonly used by different organizations. And it's very commonly practiced. These are like risk management, and change management is also one of those. So I chose this topic because I think it will help a lot of people using this process in their organization when they're practicing ITIL, when they're implementing ITIL, and it will help them to understand how these different processes of ITIL are working. So this is kind of also a sample of one of the processes we have in out of 26 ITIL processes. Yes, back to you, Don.
Okay. Well, I want to say welcome to all of those who are just now joining us. Welcome to the webinar, Change Management Using ITIL Best Practices. We're with Azhar Khuwaja and just about to start our discussion on the ITIL framework. So let's get started with the webinar. Over to you, Azhar.
Thank you very much. So let's start with this webinar. And as you know that I'm going to speak about the change management, which is one of the processes in ITIL foundation course. And this is one of the very commonly used process in different organizations when they need to change, when they are in the production environment and there's a requirement or there's a need to change. That's something very commonly used. So I'm very excited to share my knowledge and experience in this regard. So if you got any questions, just feel free to type your question, and I will be I will answer this question as we move on with this webinar. And you can also go to our site, which is the expertconnect.quickstart.com, and you can also post questions over there, and I will make sure that I can answer your questions over there. So yeah, so let's start with the change management as okay. So before I get into this change management, I would like to say a few fundamental things about the ITIL. If in case you are new to this field, as we all know that ITIL is basically Information Technology Infrastructure Library, and the reason we call it library is because it consists of 5 core publications, and ITIL is basically a framework we use. It's basically the IT service management framework, and it actually ensures that right processes, people, and technology are in place so that the organization can meet its business goals. So this is a simple way we can define ITIL. We all know that ITIL is very commonly used practice around the world, and there are also other frameworks, but majority of the organization, and I would say heavy majority of the organizations, they use ITIL. And so there are a few in our agenda. The first topic I kept for this ITIL basics. So there are a few things I will discuss about some fundamentals, and then we will move on to our topic, which is change management. And the first thing we'll talk about what exactly this process does, and then moving on to the request for change. For example, it's a document, and why we want to have this particular change. So this is what we're going to talk about. And then we'll also discuss the 3 different types of changes in an ITIL environment. And of course, we'll also talk about the change advisory board and emergency change advisory board. These are basically the group of people who make the decisions, and then finally the contingency planning and the summary. So this is what our agenda for today, and it's going to be very interesting. I'm sure ITIL is always very interesting. So let's start with some few basics, and then we'll get into our main topic, which is the change management. So as I said, ITIL, just if you can describe it in simple words, it's about the set of publication for good practices in IT service management. If you were wondering what is good practices, it's about the best practices that comes from the industry research, academic research, industry, what they normally do in the industry, what they have observed. So this is what these all practices come from, these sources. And then the question is, what is IT service management? Because we offering this ITIL, which is basically, as I said, the best practices. What exactly the IT service? IT service management, if I can tell you in short, it's basically a bridge between customer and the IT. So what is best for the customer? For example, if I have let's say a salesperson in my company, and then he or she requires a computer, and that person travels a lot, would it be, if as far as if I have to supply a computer, it could be a desktop or laptop, but both are computers. But then we know that providing him or her a laptop would be actually a better solution, because that person has to move a lot, travel a lot. So um, what we're trying to say here is we are making a bridge between a customer and the IT. And that's what we mean in IT service management. It basically describes a strategic approach for designing, delivering, managing, and improving the way we use IT in any organization. So it's pretty simple, straightforward. Then the question is, what is a service? Well, we all use services, tons of services every day. As far as the IT services are concerned, in our organizations, in IT environments, we also use this IT services. Let's take an example, having an internet services from ISP. That's one example of a service. So, the way we describe service is basically a means of delivering value to customers. If you wondering what is mean by value, value is always defined by the customer. Um, it may mean differently. It may mean different targets for different customers. For some customers it may be the cost of the service. For other customers it may be something to do with the quality of the service. So the definition of value depends on how the customer wants to interpret it. So a service is simply a delivering value to the customer, and the value is always defined by the customer, as I said. And then we want to provide outcomes to the customer without involving customer into any ownership or any risk. For example, if I'm providing IT internet services to a customer, well, the customer is not responsible if I have any outage or any, let's say, damage to my hardware resources, or my, any other damage to my infrastructure, because the customer's only concerned with the final outcome. So if we look into everyday life, we use tons of different services, but in IT, that's also very similar. And then, we would like to provide what the customer exactly looking for and considers it as a valuable. Then there's also one common term we use in ITIL, which is what is the process. And as I said in the beginning, that change management is also one of the processes, and there are 26 processes discussed in ITIL foundation course. So the question is, what exactly is a process? Process is just a methodology It answers the question how. It's basically, um, we need to define workflows and constraints about it. So it's kind of a procedural approach that focus on, different set of activities which result in a specific objective. So that's the process. And then there's also commonly term we use in ITIL is what is the function? Function. There are 4 functions discussed in ITIL Foundation course, and all these 4 functions are discussed in service operations stage of service life cycle, and I'm going to talk about it in a moment. But in general, function is about the final results, and it just answers our question about what. It's kind of a group of people trying to achieve a specific uh, you know target, or for example, there is a infrastructure management, application management. They are all examples of functions, and they're all part of the service operations stage of service life cycle. So these are some basics of the ITIL, and there's also a very common thing we would like to know about the ITIL is what are the 5 stages of service life cycle in ITIL, because ITIL consists of 5 core publications, and these 5 core publications actually address each life cycle, each stage of service life cycle or phase of service life cycle. So what do we mean by service life cycle? Very simple. From the service creation to service retirement, that's the service life cycle. So we have divided this entire from the service creation to service retirement into 5 stages. And this is how we, divide these things into this. So for example, the if we take a example of any service, these are the 5 phases. For example, from service strategy is the first phase or first stage of service life cycle. Then it moves on to the second, which is service design, later on service transition, service operations, and finally, the 5th one we have is the continual service improvement. So these are the 5 stages, and it's pretty easier to deal with by dividing into these 5 stages. And basically we can take care of different aspects of service during these stages. And so that's really very useful, in that case. So if in, let's say, what is the service strategy? It's basically about understanding organizational objectives and customer needs. For example, if I'm an internet service provider and I'm providing dial-up services to my customers, but then I realize that my customers are looking for, or they consider value in the broadband, the services. So this might be the stage where I would like to set up the organizational objectives. For example, we would like to offer broadband services to address our customers, corporate customers' needs, and we would like to gradually move from the dial-up services to the broadband services. So this is something which can, you define in the service strategy. In service strategy, you also have to keep in mind that you have the necessary finances and the budget to take care of this. So it's basically, you should, we ask why something should be done before asking how. So this is how the service strategy phases. And then comes to the service design, which is the second stage of service life cycle in an ITIL. And in service design, is basically we turn service strategy into the blueprint for delivering the business objectives. So how this service should be, what should be the specifications of this service, what should be the design, how it should be designed, what should be the different aspects of this, and how it's going to be deployed in a supported environment. So these are the things we consider in the service design stage of service lifecycle. And the third stage is the service transition. And our topic, change management, is also a process which belongs to this phase of service life cycle, the service transition. Every stage of service life cycle has, you know, few processes associated with it. And as I said, there are total 26 processes. So the change management belongs to service transition stage of service life cycle. And service transition is about providing guidance for the deployment, for the development and improvement, for example, let's say you want to introduce new services into a production environment, or you want to introduce the modified services into the live production environment. This is the stage where you take care of those things. It you know, it's basically takes care of all the issues, risks associated in that particular stage. So we just want to make it a smooth transition. We just want to make it you know, risk free, or maybe with a minimal risk. And so that's what we're looking at into the service transition. Because when you're dealing with a live environment or in a production environment, you have to be very um, you know, you know, understand the environment, because you know, there are not many chances that you can actually, because the services are live, and it may result in, you know, the outage of services if something is not done as per the guidelines. So this is very important stage of service life cycle. The fourth one is service operations. Very simple. It's basically talks about the day-to-day things we do in the services. For example, you know, dealing with the outages, dealing with the errors, dealing with the quality issues, dealing with the service related complaints, dealing with these customers issues, having a service desk, taking care of the different calls regarding these issues. So service operation, as I said, simply that takes care of day-to-day issues. And then the fifth one, continual service improvement. It's an ongoing thing. It's basically, it doesn't stop. It is actually implemented on rest of the 4 stages of service life cycle. It looks for the opportunities to find improvements in different stages of service life cycle. You know, it uses something like Deming cycle and the different approaches basically to find opportunities in different stages of these different you know, stages of service life cycle. So these are the 5 stages, as I said. So and these 5 stages have core publications, and that's the reason we call it ITIL, IT Infrastructure Library, because it consists of 5 core publications, and these core publications actually address these individual stages of service life cycle. So it's pretty useful. It's pretty easy to understand about a service, about the different aspects of service, as I said, from service you know, creation to service retirement. And it makes it so easy for us to go through that. So let's move on to the actual topic, change management. And change management is about bringing a change. As I said, change management is a process which is part of the transition stage of service life cycle. And in transition stage, we are dealing with a live environment or production environment. So any change you want to make in this environment, you have to make sure that you go through all the required you know, aspects, or all the required you know, parameters which are mentioned in this process, in this change management process. So that's why you can't just make a change right away. We would love to do it, but it's not the way it is done in a production and live environment. For example, you were asked by your vendor to upgrade your 32-bit server to 64-bit server, because their new software may not support the 32-bit server. You know, or there's another change example I can provide you. For example, you've been asked by your vendor to upgrade your operating system from Windows Server 2012 to Windows Server 2016. The question is, can you do it right away? Um, or do you need to follow a certain process? Well, it's a live environment. It affects your customers. It affects everyone who's using those services. So you have to follow a certain process, which is the change management. And change management makes sure that your changes are smooth, your changes are result in as per your expectation in desired results, and then they don't result in something you did not expect or something which result in outages. So change management makes it very smooth, changes into this live, production environment. And why do we need to change? As I said, there are different reasons. There may be a customer's requirement. There may be a customer's, different service expectation. Sometimes there are also mergers between different organizations, and they need to outsource, in-source, do the co-sourcing. So there could be different reasons why they want to modify their services. So that's why changes are a part of this, and then this change management process is very useful in making these changes smooth, and making them successful. So that's all the basic theme of the change management. Now the question is, how do you make a change request? For example, if you would like to have a change, what is the method of? There are different ways you can communicate these change requests. For example, in general, we all aware of that. We use the service desk call to request for the changes, but then we can also do if we it's a part of the project, and the project related a call we can make. But the very common thing we do here is to you know make a document. Is basically write it down why we would like to have this change. It's called RFC, request for change. And request for change, in that document you write down all your, the why you would like to have this change, and what are the uh, reasons behind it, and uh, what is the timeline you're looking at in terms of having this change. And so these are the things you would like to write it down in this document and making a change request. So that's kind of a formal procedure which is very common, and which is normally used in most cases when a change is requested. So, so with the change proposal, as I said, you go through, you document all these, you write down all these changes you would like to have, you describe the things which are why you would like to have this change, and what brings, what will be the result of this, for example, and then what desired outcomes you expecting from this change. So this is what you write it down. And then there are two things we should keep in mind when we write down this, go through this document. Is basically we need to define warranty and utility in this proposal. What is warranty and utility? Well, both warranty and utility are required in order to have a value. As I said earlier, that value is defined by the customer, and value can have a different meaning for different customers. For some customers it may be low cost of the service. For other customers it may be something to do with the quality. For example, I expect my ISP to always provide me, 10 Mbps, not less than at any given time, or uninterrupted services, 365 days a year, 7 days a week. So these could be different depending on customer, depending on customer's business, depending on customer's environment. They may have a different expectations from about the service. And this is what we say, that these values are different for different customers. And the value actually depends on two things: warranty and utility. One is, it describes as the fit for purpose, and the other one is the fit for use. So this is what we expect. For example, in case of warranty, we mean fit for use, and in case of utility, we mean it's a fit for purpose. So any service we're looking at, is it really fulfilling both of these things? If yes, well, then that definitely justifies the case. So we can also write down the schedule, for example, how long we expecting this change to occur. And for example, the timelines roughly we can provide. And also we justify, what are the significance of these changes, and what will bring, the output from this change. So that's the change proposal. Now, there are three different types of service changes: um, standard changes, normal changes, and emergency changes. If you're going for standard changes, you don't need a document, or you don't need a proposal to go ahead with the making a request for this and going through a formal procedure. Standard changes are considered low cost or considered low risk, because there is no any apparently drawback, or any apparently issue you can see with those changes. For example, to reset my password. Now, that's not really something which can result in some, high risk thing, or any, damage to significant damage to infrastructure. So it's kind of a everyday change. It's kind of a regular thing we're looking at. So standard changes are basically pre-authorized changes, and there's already a defined procedure for these standard changes. As I said, they are low risk changes, and even if they're not going to be harmful to our infrastructure, to our in our environment. But then when it comes to other two changes, normal changes and emergency changes, yes, we have to write a proposal. Normal changes are something where we need to write a proposal and justify our case. Why would we want to have these changes? You can further divide these normal changes into three different categories. For example, major, significant, and minor. Now, how do you categorize those? It depends on your own judgment, because ITIL doesn't define what should be coming in the major, or what should be part of the significant or minor changes. So it's up to the organization to define what they consider, and how they want to categorize those within the normal changes. So they may consider different parameters, like based on the impact, cost, complexity, risk. And based on this, they can decide whether this change falls into major, minor, or significant. And you definitely need a proposal in order to request for this change. And then comes to the emergency changes. These are the changes you need to implement, you need to have right away. You don't have time to the uh, to go for the formal procedure. These are something you need to speed up. For example, there are hot fixes from the vendors we receive for our software, for our operating system. These hot fixes are basically addressing the vulnerability in our software, in our let's say in some cases hardware also, but in our software, in our operating system. And because they have discovered a security gap, or maybe a flaw, or maybe a weakness, or let's say as I said, vulnerability in operating systems. So they advising us to immediately apply this hotfix, as the name says. And we're all familiar with the Microsoft operating system. They often also suggest the hotfixes. So this is an example of emergency change where you do not want to take formal procedure or time. You just would like to proceed with it on a urgent basis. So these are the emergency changes. So I hope these, now you're familiar with these three types of changes. The standard changes, you don't need to go through a approval procedure. You can just apply those. Why? Because they don't result in any high risk, or they not gonna be damaging anything in your infrastructure or IT assets. So these are low risk changes, and these are pre-authorized. So you don't really need to go through the formal procedure. But other two, normal changes and emergency changes, yes, you have to go through a formal procedure. Normal changes, just the changes, but they are not on urgent basis. But the emergency changes, as the name says, they have to taken into emergency. They have to be taken into on urgent basis. So this is what we the three types of services. So as I said, standard changes, something you just password reset, and this is something you can right away go with it, and there's no any apparently complexity or risk or any issue involved with this. So these are well known and documented changes, and they are already, as I said, pre-authorized, and there's not much issue with those applying those standard changes. Then there's a concept of change advisory board. Uh, then please let me know if you have any question for me from any of the participants. I would love to. And
I don't see any questions yet.
okay, good. Thanks. Okay, good. So change advisory board is, you can say, a committee of um, experts in your organization who actually, based on their experience, based on their exposure, they make the decision. So your document, which you have, developed for the change, for example, in case of normal changes, you forward it to this change advisory board. And change advisory board consists of experts in your organization from different departments, you can say, maybe from IT support, maybe from software development, from the let's say infrastructure team. So these are the experts, and they sit together and they decide based on the proposal or the request they have received for the change in case of normal change requests. They go through all the details of the change which has been requested by the concern, and based on their experience, they walk through this and they figure out if there are any, um, complexities associated with that, or if there can be any risks which may, associated by making or implementing those changes. So they, as I said, based on their experience and exposure, they go through this and they make a judgment on this. So this is a formal procedure, and sometimes we also include customer in this change advisory board. I mean, we know that the members of this change advisory board are the people, the technical experts in our organization. But sometimes in some cases, when we think that the customer may also be involved, may also be affected by that, or in some cases when we think that we may need to bring supplier also into that equation. So in that case, we also invite people from supplier, people from the customers, and then we also have them as part of this change advisory board. and so that they can also have their opinion and perspective, because ultimately they might be affected by that change also. This change may affect them. So that's the reason, we can also have these in our this change advisory board. And it should reflect both the customer and user views. Now the question is, what's the difference between a customer and a user? A customer is like an organization which is, uh, s- you know, um, is subscribing or is using your services. For example, my organization, QuickStart, is a customer of an internet service provider company. So in that case, the organization is a customer, and the user is the person who's using that service. So any employee, like I am one of the user in that case, and who's actually using the service. So the difference between customer and user is, customer is the organization and user is the person who's using that service. So you need to keep both views and perspective in mind. And also, uh, the question is how many members you should have in change advisory board. Well, there's no rule, hard and fast for this. It depends. It may vary. And also, a question I often get asked by my trainees is, um, do you need to make a decision in just a single meeting? Like, when you have all the change advisory board members, and should they decide about that particular change, whether to accept it or reject it right away, or maybe, in a single meeting, or you can also have more meetings for in future. For example, if you unable to come to a conclusion or unable to make a decision. So yeah, there's no restriction on that. If the members think that they may need to have a meeting again later on, and in this regard, so that's also a possibility. They don't need to make a decision in a single meeting. It could be ongoing process. It may take more than one meetings if required. So as I said, supplier can also be part of this, and you can in change advisory board you mostly see these experts and all these things. Okay, okay, so I see a question here. Is there maybe, okay, so the third type we were talking about before that, as I said, there are three types of changes, and we already talked about these standard changes and normal changes. The third type is emergency changes. And as I said, the emergency changes are those changes which needs to be taken care of right away on urgent basis, on emergency basis, as the name suggests. An example, as I said, you need to apply a hot fix. You need to apply a patch or maybe something which is very necessary, and immediately it should be applied, because in order to deal with a particular vulnerability or weakness or gap or flaw in your software, in your operating system, your vendor has suggested you to immediately have this. But then the thing is, because you are in a production environment or you are in a live environment, you cannot actually apply this change right away. So that's why still you need to follow the change management procedure. But then the thing is that comes into the emergency changes. So these are the,
Azhar,
yes, go ahead.
we
Yeah,
do have a question.
sure.
How does the CAB function in terms of decision making? Uh, do they vote on a final decision?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and thank you very much for bringing this question up. So it actually, my experience based on this, I can suggest that it goes with the majority. And there are, there's a change manager also part of this change advisory board. And then, as I said, there are experts. If they, there are cases when not everyone agrees with a single solution, so they go with the majority. Yes. Okay, so coming back to the emergency changes, as I said that the emergency changes are something we really need to. So the question is, who should be the member of the, who will make this emergency changes decision? Now we have a ECAP. First we had the CAP, which is the Change Advisory Board, and now we have a ECAP, and ECAP is Emergency Change Advisory Board. So this is something we call it as a subset of the standard CAP. Um, because it's on urgent basis, you may not have a full strength of members in that meeting. You may have uh, the part of these members or not all present, and it can be called at also any time. I mean, it's not really a formal, or it's not really something is scheduled, as the name says, emergency, so you need to take care of that on urgent basis. So emergency cap, you may have a low number of members in that ECAP, and also you need to speed up your decisions in when in ECAP, because as the nature of the change is need to be taken care of on urgent basis. So this is what the emergency change. They evaluate, they go through all the aspects of this change, and based on this they make a decision whether they should approve it or they should reject it. And based on this proposal, they still need to submit the proposal like they used to do in the CAP, also for the ECAP, but here it is taken into consideration like on an urgent basis, as I said. So what are the challenges when you deal with the emergency changes? Well, there's always a pressure, and just do it. But then the thing is, you have to follow this change management process. And by following this change management process, you actually making sure that the things go smooth, things go as per your expectations. And, it should not affect your live services which are in production. And it should not, create any unscheduled outages or any quality issues for your customers. So if you would like to make a smooth change, you just have to follow this change management process. And we understand that emergency changes are something we really need to take into account on urgent basis, but then it's still we need to follow the procedure, because if something goes wrong or the things don't go the way we expected, well, then we are actually inviting a outage, unscheduled outage, and that may result in loss of revenue, loss of reputation for the organization. Also, we lose our customer confidence, so it's inconvenience. So these are all things which are associated if we don't follow this procedure as we defined by the ITIL. So ITIL makes every effort to make sure that this change process is smooth and this. Okay, so the question is, once we have this approval, and then do we have a question or?
Sorry about that. Couldn't find my mute button. How can we stop all change requests from being treated as emergency changes? In my experience, 90% of change requests come in as emergencies.
Well, that may be true, but ITIL doesn't define that which changes you should be considering as the emergency changes and which one you should be considering as the normal changes. So it depends on the organization. It depends on your own environment as a service provider, what you think is should be under. But just I gave you an example of a general example. For example, in hot fixes, something we need to do it on urgent basis. But then it also depends on our own environment and in our own judgment, what we think it should be, more done on the urgent basis and can be taken at, as a regular or routine procedure. So yeah. Okay, so coming to the next step, let's say you got the approval from the change advisory board, or you got the approval from the emergency change advisory board. The question is it done? I mean, is it that's it, or you can just start applying changes into the production or live environment, or is there something else you need to do also? So, well, the answer is that no, there is still something you need to do. Even after you got the approval from the change advisory board or the emergency change advisory board, whatever the case may be, you still need to go through, there's still a procedure. And then that procedure is just wants to make sure that when you apply those changes, they don't reflect in, or they don't turn out to be something which did not expect, like let's say change into some outages or unscheduled outages. So when you get an approval, you need to test it in a virtualized environment to see how it, what's the output, how this change is going to be after you apply that. So we all know virtualized environment is ideal for testing. We know that a virtualized environment is we can experiment even if something goes wrong. It's just the experimental. So we need to apply those changes in that environment to see how, because some changes are irreversible. What I mean by that, once you apply a change, you cannot go back to its previous state. Let's say if the change is not as per your expectation, you cannot go back to the previous state. Let's say if you had a server running in a fine condition and you applied the change and the change did not result the way you expected, and you cannot actually reverse the change because some changes, as I said, may be irreversible. So what you should do in that case, you should have a baseline documented. And what is a baseline? Baseline is kind of a set of all the specifications, configurations you have in your documents about that particular service or about that particular server, let's say in question, when it was running in a smooth, in a normal, under normal circumstances, when it was working without any issue. So we want to note down all these specifications, all the parameters, all the details when the server was running fine, when the server, before we applied those changes. And why we want to do this is because if something goes wrong, or let's say if the change results in in an outage, um, and it's irreversible, we can reproduce, or we can actually have a duplicate. We can have a bring the same server into this environment. So we can recreate that. So
As-
baseline is very important. Yes, go ahead, Dan.
Oh, sorry, Azhar. We do have another question.
Sure.
They're writing, usually on our emergency cab, we have an area expertise in each area to be able to make better emergency decisions to cut down on the number of emergency changes.
Yes, that's true. Because there are in different environments, you can actually expect some of the emergency changes in advance. And when you expect those changes, for example, again, I come back to the same example of hot fixes, which is a very common thing so you can define a procedure for this in advance, and you can sort of speed up that process, rather than walking through each and every step. So that's also this practice is common, and that's exactly according to ITIL practices. So that's valid point. Yes. So coming back to the so it's basically we looking for contingency planning. For example, if the changes doesn't go the way we expected, even if they got approved from the change advisory board or the ECAP, it depending on what type of changes we're looking at. So in that case, we want to try out, we want to test, we want to see if how these changes will be. And we, as I said, we will be using this virtualized environment, and that virtualized environment will actually help us to see how these changes are. And then, we always have a baseline documented, so you should be able to produce a similar server or similar infrastructure or similar asset or similar the service, if in case we are at a stage where we are at the irreversible condition where we cannot go back to our actual reverse back to the actual state. So that's very important. So but what happens if things really go wrong? And that can also happen, in certain cases. Well, you're unable to, let's say, the things really getting out of this. So in that case, you may want to invoke the business continuity plan. We all know that business continuity plan is a plan we use, and in order to, within a defined time frame, within a defined timeline, how can we bring our business back into production, bring our production, having our production back in running. So this is what the BCP, every organization, I'm sure, has a BCP, and then we also have a disaster recovery planning as part of it. So if things really go wrong, we can always invoke the BCP, and BCP has all the defined stages. But that's something very extreme condition I'm talking about. That normally, it's not the regular, or it's not the routine case. It's just something um, sometimes may happen, and so that's the also alternate we have. So this is, so what basically we're talking about here is having a contingency or a backup plan, and how can we do it, and making sure that everything we do during those ITIL processes is documented. Every testing we do, every all these things are documented. And so in that case, if we have to refer it in future, we should not have to do the relearn. We can learn from what we have already, we can refer from what we have already learned in the previously. So we need to document each and everything in that case. So coming back to the some of the topics we already summarizing all these things. Why we want to have a change management in simple words. As I said, change management is a process of ITIL. It's associated with the transition stage of service life cycle. It deals with the live services, the production environments where you cannot afford to have, take any chances. You just want to make sure that your changes are smooth, your changes are as per your expectations, your changes are, very, as you expected. So these changes should be follow this process, and if we follow this process, the chances are that there won't be risks associated with this. There won't be quality issues, and mostly we should be able to um, make the change. So the things we discuss, if I can summarize in this change management, is we talked about the change request types, and we discussed the the proposal and the document justifying the case and presenting it in front of the change advisory board. giving ownership to the change manager and takes care of that, writing these change proposal, and then deciding, which change type is it. For example, as we discussed, out of these three different types, normal, standard, and the emergency, we need to categorize. And then we need to have these, the committees, for example, for the change advisory board or ECAB, depending. And finally, we need to have a contingency planning if in case, in worst cases, or if, let's say, the things don't go the way we expected. So all the things you do in the change management, they should be recorded, evaluated, and follow this process. So this is what about the change management. And um, so any other question, Dan, regarding this?
No other questions in the question box.
Okay, good. Okay, so probably all right, so let me just go through quick things. I really encourage all the participants, if they have any further question, I would be very happy to answer this question. And as I said, you can always, if you think of a question later on, you can always go to our Expert Connect website, and it's a great way of learning, and you can type in your questions over there, and I will make sure that I will answer all your questions posted over there. So
Any other questions out there? Well, we do have a comment. One person said, "This is great. Thank you."
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thanks. So, okay. All right. Okay, good. So back to you, Dan. Thanks.
All right. Well, I want to say thanks, everyone. Please feel free to reach out to me at dan.murphy@quickstart.com if you have any feedback, questions, or suggestions. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you for joining the webinar, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.